Well, thank you all for coming tonight to this event. We're pleased to be able to host this lecture and discussion in this beautiful space. Thank you to New St. Andrews College, as well as to the Hale Institute here at the college for making this event possible. Worldview is an important idea for the last few generations of the Reformed churches in America and for the evangelical church as a whole. Worldview has been at the center of many Christian educational endeavors and has helped many churches and families better understand and resist the assault of unbiblical ideologies. Indeed, the last 150 years has seen the rise of incredibly destructive ideologies, which Christian and conservative thinkers have sought to unmask and to defang in a variety of ways. But are we doing worldview right? Are there ways that our current idea and practice of worldview education is actually cutting against our goals rather than helping them? Our speaker tonight will hopefully address this important issue and help us think through it together. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Simon Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy is a research fellow at the University of Queensland in Australia and a non-resident fellow at the Danube Institute in Budapest. He's associate editor of Quadrant magazine and teaches at a variety of institutions, including the Lachlan Mockery Institute, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, and Queensland Theological College. He's the author of a recent book, Reforming the Law of Nature, The Secularization of Political Thought from 1532 to 1689. He has published a number of articles on a range of topics in legal and political history, including on Johannes Althusius, Richard Hooker, Abraham Kuyper, and a number of other important and interesting figures. He has a book that I thought was forthcoming, but is actually out. So I encourage you to take a look at this book. We have copies up here for sale. I have no idea how much. I have no idea who you pay, but they are up here, and Dr. Kennedy will help you acquire your copy after the talk. The title of the book is Against Worldview, and that is the theme of tonight. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Simon Kennedy.
All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. And I want to say a special thank you to Jeff Schaefer at the Hale Institute for inviting me to come all the way to Moscow. We live in Brisbane in Australia, and probably you have no idea where that is. It's in a state called Queensland, and I like to think of Queensland as a cross between Florida and Texas, if that gives you any idea of the weather and the culture and the political disposition of our state. But I am here to talk about my new book, which is Against Worldview, and I understand David was right to say it's published, but I think if you ordered it on Amazon, you wouldn't get it until December, but you can get it today, which is good for you if you want a copy. But let me start by talking about the city of Sydney. So Sydney lies on the mid-east coast of Australia, and if you're old enough to remember the 2000 Olympic Games, I know some of you aren't, but that's okay. That was the city that the Olympic Games were held in the year 2000. It's Australia's largest city, and it's on the site of the original British colonial settlement on the continent. And the city has two natural borders. On the eastern side is the Pacific Ocean, so the city's not going to go any further there. And on the western side, you have a mountain range called the Blue Mountains. And there's a saying in Australia about the Blue Mountains: they look good from a distance, but up close, they lose their charm. So people might say that something or someone that looks different from a distance to how it looks up close is like the Blue Mountains. And the perspective changes as you get closer. And as you see it up close, you realise it's not as beautiful as you think. It's different to what you expect once you've had a good look at it. And I think the idea of Christian worldview is a little bit like the Blue Mountains. David's right to say it's been a really important tool for Christians in the last 150 years. It's played an important role in Christian public discourse, in Christian apologetics, and in various Christian intellectual endeavours. But I would argue that Christian worldview looks good from a distance. It feels like the idea really helps with Christian education. It sounds great when you say you have a Christian worldview perspective on something, or you teach from a Christian worldview. It sounds like you're doing the Christian thing when you're doing the Christian worldview thing. But I want to suggest to you tonight that the Christian worldview concept, as it's typically deployed in Christian education circles in particular, is actually not fit for purpose. So I'll explain why that's the case. I'm also going to explain an understanding of Christian worldview that I think can work. So I'm not going to throw the idea out completely, but I do want to say that the way people typically use it is unhelpful. So to that end, I'm going to outline what I posit in the book, and that is I posit a Christian philosophy of education that makes sense of how we learn, the biblical view of the content and ends of education, and I'm going to finish by exploring what this might mean for Christian education more broadly today. So I'm going to start with the problem with worldview. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear the word worldview, I hear it all the time in Christian circles, all the time. So it gets bandied about regularly. And it seems to have a lot of currency in evangelical and particularly Reformed circles. And it's used by pastors and parachurch ministries. It's regularly deployed in Christian books about apologetics and philosophy and education and theology. And it's often used, at least in Australia, and I understand as well in the United States, in Christian schools and Christian colleges and universities. And I'm mainly interested in those latter set of institutions, that is the education institutions. But let me say that I think there are deep-seated foundational issues with the concept of worldview. Now, people often start their critique of worldview by trying to link it to what they think is a dubious philosophical lineage, and that's fair enough. But I'm actually not very worried about the fact that the term for worldview, or Weltanschauung, was first used by German idealists like Immanuel Kant and Schelling and G.W.F. Hegel. In fact, if anything, I think that's kind of fun. Each of those thinkers actually has something interesting and useful to say in different ways, so I'm not actually very stressed about the fact that the German idealist used it first. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is how Christians use it. And what I've discovered about this makes the whole concept of a Christian worldview pretty murky and tricky. The people who deployed the concept first were good people. They were Protestants, they were Reformed, including one of the heroes of the Reformed faith, Abraham Kuyper. Now, I'll keep the story about worldview pretty brief. There's a whole chapter on it in the book. But the short version is this, that people like Kuyper and those who followed him used worldview for what I would call cultural combat. It was a tool of differentiation and conflict. And so people from Abraham Kuyper to Cornelius Van Til to R.J. Rushdoony to Francis Schaeffer to John MacArthur today all used worldview as a way of differentiating from and combating with other purported worldviews. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But I also think that that's no way to build a foundation for a philosophy of education. Education is a project of people formation and disciple making and culture building. A concept like worldview, if understood in the typical way, can't be a foundation for thinking about Christian education, in my view. A second problem lies with the concept itself, and this is where we come back to the Blue Mountains outside of Sydney. From a distance, things look good. But then when you get closer, they start to look ugly. What do we mean by a Christian worldview perspective? Think about that for a second. What do we mean when we say we're teaching from a Christian worldview? How does having a Christian worldview make a difference in learning how to become a good mathematics teacher or a historian or a business owner? Let me explain something from my own personal experience. So the setting where it became really frustrating for me was actually as a college professor in the banal world of curriculum documentation. At the college where I used to teach, and I love the college and I feel warmly toward it, so if anyone from that college ever listens to this, don't I hope their feelings aren't hurt. Every course at this college that I taught at needed to have these set of learning outcomes as part of the bureaucratic process. And every course needed to have a learning outcome related to Christian worldview. That was what we were told. And this raised big questions for me, because how do you frame a Christian worldview learning outcome for a course on ancient Greek and Roman poetry, or a course on the history of World War II, and so on? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me once you get down to brass tacks. Okay, let me ask you some other questions. If you don't quote the Bible in class, does that mean you didn't teach from a Christian worldview perspective? Did you fail? Maybe merely having Christian ideas or frameworks is enough, but how do you know if your ideas are distinctively Christian? How do you know they're not re-engineered liberal secular ideas with a Christian garnish? And what about the possibility of truth being discovered from outside the confines of the Christian community? Many cultures with quite varied belief systems have come to scientific, philosophical, and even forms of religious truth without access to a Christian worldview perspective. So presumably, they did so by using their God-given reason. And so this raises the question of what role Christian revelation plays in academic pursuits. And it raises the question of, do Christians have a privileged access to intellectual truth? Now, I ask these questions because the answers to them are actually not as obvious as we might sometimes think. And they all come back to this question of worldview. And in my view and my experience, worldview does not add up as an idea. It feels intuitively plausible, but it lacks coherence and doesn't work very well in practice. So, what's the answer to this problem? Well, instead of abandoning the worldview ship, we could repair it from the inside. And so here's where I want to start. I want to start by repairing the worldview ship from the inside and construct a philosophy of Christian education. So we're going to start doing that now. So where do we begin? Well, it's important to define your terms. And so I'm going to start with my own definition of worldview. Worldview is a true apprehension of reality that is attained through the process of learning about God, the self, and the world. People have a Christian worldview once they apprehend reality in a way that provides them with holistic insight into right thinking and right living. Now, to talk about how we learn and what kind of philosophy of education we need to have, we need to answer that question of how we know and how we learn. And these are both questions of epistemology, which is the question of how we know things, but they're also basic to this question of education. Now, what's the best way of thinking about how we know? Because we need to go back to that question. How do we know what we think is true? This is one of the basic areas of disagreement in philosophy and theology, and there's been lots of different answers to this. And the problem is this one. Our minds encounter the world. And how do those two things meet? So this is sometimes called the problem of subject and object, which is they're nerdy philosophical concepts. But this is basically this problem of the thinker and the thing being thought about, or the seer and the thing being seen. And how do we reconcile these two things? Does what we perceive match what we actually encounter? And many have argued that the answer is no, they do not match. But let me cut to the chase. They actually do match. I'm eliminating a lot of content. Yeah. Now I'm going to use a theologian that some of you will have heard of, Herman Bavinck. Herman Bavinck writes about Christian worldview in his originally titled book, Christian Worldview. He writes that this is what he says: knowledge of truth is possible only if we begin with the fact that subject and object, knowing and being, that those things correspond to each other. So the very foundations of scholarship and intellectual investigation and science rest on that being true, that there is a correspondence between the knower and the thing being known. And our ordinary experience and approach to this problem of subject and object is to assume that there is a unity between what we see and what we know. That's just how we live our lives. And if you're a Christian, you believe that God is the creator of both your mind and your senses and the world that your mind and your senses are perceiving. So we assume that what we are seeing is really there, and then we think about what we see. So all the way through this process, we assume that our perceptions are reliable We assume that the world really does exist, and we presume that what we see is really there. And this acceptance that the external world that we sense and that we move in as it appears matches with what we see in the Bible. So I'm going to give you some scriptures that show that this is the case. Romans 1:19 and 20 says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." So the Apostle Paul here affirms that knowledge about God, no less, can be garnered through sense perception and observation of things that were created by him. And the Psalms speak repeatedly like this as well. I'll give you a couple of examples. Psalm 8, verses 3-4, the psalmist says, "When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, and the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him?" Psalm 19 points the reader to the work of God in the heavens that we observe with our senses. Psalm 34:8 calls us to taste and see that the Lord is good. Psalm 46:8 urges us to behold the works of the Lord. Psalm 66 says, "Come and see what God has done." So the Bible doesn't actually call our perception of created reality into question at all, but rather affirms it. So we can affirm as Christians that God made the world, he made it knowable, and he made us to know it. And this position is called Christian realism. And it's my view that that forms the basis of a sound Christian philosophy of education. And it helps us to think about how we learn. So let's think about that now. How do we learn? Well, generally speaking, we learn bit by bit, piece by piece. We crawl before we can walk. We walk before we can run. We build on prior knowledge bit by bit and piece by piece towards a full body of knowledge and truth. We don't generally start a learning process with a completed big picture of reality and then fit everything in to that big picture. And the image I like to use is of a mosaic. So if you've got a big mosaic on a church building, for example, mosaicists gradually build a beautiful work of art, don't they? Tile by tile and piece by piece. And the mosaic is akin to the finished product of the educational process, if we think about it like that. And for our purposes, I want to think about Christian worldview as the finished mosaic. The finished product of a Christian education is a Christian view of the world. Now, the interesting thing about this is that no one has the master plan for the mosaic except for God. We might have little bits and pieces of it, but we don't have the full picture. Let me put this another way. The world out there contains lots of little pieces of truth that we can make sense of. People observe the world around them and gradually refine their understanding of it. And in their spiritual lives, people of faith renew their minds spiritually through reading the scriptures and prayer and gathering with God's people. And gradually they build a picture of the world as it really is. People gather bits of that truth and organise them into categories. And so I would say that people by and large learn inductively. They build gradually upon their knowledge. So let's do that. Let's build upon that fact and think a bit more about education and learning. Now, what is education? Here's my definition. Education is the deliberate, methodical enhancement of the natural inclination people have to grow in their understanding of reality. And so education is the way people accelerate their ability to make intelligent and informed connections between things in the world, between things in the world and themselves, between things in the world and God and themselves and God. And these connections can be construed as relations. And so education can be framed as being about those relations. And this is what Charlotte Mason does. You might have heard of Charlotte Mason. She's quite big in Christian education circles. And she talks about education as the science of relations. Education is the process of learning about other things and other people, past, present, and future. The purpose of education is to facilitate the student's relationship to these things so the student can live well in the world. And that idea of students learning about these relations so they can live well in the world leads quite naturally to the concept of wisdom, because central to my argument is actually that understanding the world and ourselves and God and living well in light of that understanding is actually a really good definition of wisdom. And I would put to you that wisdom is the main education-related concept in the scriptures. Indeed, I think to fix the idea of Christian worldview education, we need to bring the concepts of wisdom and worldview together. And there are two predominant influences in the way we think about wisdom. So we're going to think about wisdom for a little bit now. There's the Greeks and there's the scriptures. That's sort of the two main streams of how we think about wisdom in the West. So for example, Aristotle taught that wisdom had two main aspects. First, there's practical wisdom, or phronesis, which describes deliberate action in the world. And there's another wisdom, according to Aristotle, which is Sophia, which is theoretical contemplation of things beyond our action. And that's where we get our word philosophy from, Sophia. Now, the presentation of wisdom in the scriptures is not dissimilar to this, but there's contrast in how it's emphasized and framed. But let's think about the book of Job, for example. So wisdom in the book of Job is depicted as the solution to the existential and spiritual quandary that Job faces. However, wisdom is ultimately found to be as mysterious and elusive as any other solution that is presented to him, because in Job 28, it says that getting wisdom is like mining for precious stones beneath the ground. That is, it's really hard to get wisdom. Wisdom is hidden from the eyes of all living. It says in Job 28:21. In Job 28:23, it says it is God who understands the way to wisdom and he knows its place. When God created all things, it says he saw it and he declared it, he established it and searched it out in verse 27, which tells us that God is the source of wisdom and the one who knows where to find it. To have wisdom, we must have access to God and also to his creation order. But then there's the book of Proverbs. And you might say that Proverbs provides the basic biblical guide to wisdom, and Job complicates that. But there are parallels between the two. So as in Job 28, where there's a link between wisdom and creation, Proverbs links those two things too. So Proverbs 3 says in 19 and 20, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps broke open and the clouds drop down the dew. And similarly in Proverbs 8, we see creation and wisdom joined together. Whereas in Proverbs 3, we see wisdom being instrumental in the creation of the world. God uses his wisdom to create the world. Proverbs 8 presents wisdom as created in a mysterious way. And then wisdom is participating in creation. It says this, ages ago I was set up. At the first, before the beginning of the earth, when there were no depths, I was brought forth. And it's talking here about wisdom. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I, that is wisdom, was brought forth. It's a mysterious passage. But we can see here that wisdom is depicted in the Proverbs as being present at the creation. And that's significant because it shows us that the structure of created reality is inherently linked to wisdom. So as Christians, we ought to hold that wisdom is linked to the way things actually are. Wisdom is at the bottom of the way the cosmos really is, as it says in Jeremiah 10:12 and Psalm 104:24. Now, this does not mean that we will always know how things actually are, of course. Our knowledge is limited and flawed in a variety of ways. But we can assert with confidence that all human action happens within the confines of a given order. Wisdom is, in fact, the ability to discern that order and to discern how the parts fit together, even if our discernment is limited by our sin and our finiteness. Wisdom must also be put into action. It's never passive. Wisdom is never purely intellectual or purely rational. It is always ultimately ethical. The wise person acts in the world in accordance with the frame of the world, with how the world is. And wisdom is linked to knowledge in several biblical texts. So knowledge is still important in acting with wisdom. For example, Proverbs 2, he says, "My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding." End quote. So it's interesting that we see here that we have to have a willing disposition towards understanding, and that's a precondition for wisdom. So there is a connection between knowledge and wisdom because we have to have this disposition to acquire knowledge. And it's the same points made in Proverbs 2:10. It says, if we submit ourselves to the wisdom that comes from God, then, I quote, "wisdom will come into your heart and knowledge will be pleasant for your soul." So knowledge is also linked to action. As I said, it has to be ethical. Wisdom has to be ethical. It's never just intellectual apprehension, not the organisation of data or something that Christian worldview typically emphasises, or Christian worldview frameworks typically emphasises organising how we think. Instead, knowledge is actually something that is possessed and then acted upon. Proverbs 13:16 says, "Every prudent man acts with knowledge." This practical emphasis is echoed in the New Testament in the book of James, which says that wisdom is shown in good conduct. James 3:13, and it says that, and I quote, "Wisdom is from above is full of mercy and good fruits, resulting in a harvest of righteousness." But this raises the question, is wisdom merely practical? Or is it also spiritual? And here's where I would also say that there are two kinds of wisdom. It's not merely practical, it is also spiritual. And there are many biblical texts that point to this, showing how Jesus Christ manifests and embodies the creational wisdom described in the Old Testament. In Ephesians 3, Paul says he preaches the gospel so that through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the rulers and authorities in heavenly places. 1 Corinthians 1:24, Paul calls Jesus Christ the wisdom of God. Why is that? How is he the wisdom of God? It says in verses 18 to 20 that in 18 to 20, he juxtaposes the Christian gospel of the cross to the wisdom of the world. In verse 21, the world is pursuing folly, and in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. So worldly wisdom looks the wrong way for salvation and spiritual wisdom, whereas those who are called, Paul says, know that Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And so this proves something that Bavinck says. There is actually only one source of wisdom, God himself. The Bible teaches that God reveals this wisdom both through creation and redemption. But the Bible also teaches that there are two kinds of wisdom: practical wisdom, which works itself out in a life well lived in God's creation order, and spiritual wisdom, which is displayed in the life of faith. Okay, so I've unpacked some of the problems with worldview. I've talked about a bit of an education theory about how we know and how we learn. So to conclude, I'm going to bring wisdom and worldview together in a way that I believe will reform Christian worldview education. I think we should rethink and reform worldview. So first, education ought to be understood as the presentation and imparting of and pursuit of wisdom. What could be more satisfying if you're a teacher than seeing a student emerge equipped with wisdom? And so I think much of the content of education can and should be classified under practical wisdom. When we're teaching students about mathematics, we're helping them gain wisdom about mathematical order, the mathematical order of reality, pardon me. And when students learning about physical education, they're gaining theoretical wisdom about the way their bodies work and practical wisdom about how to use their bodies. When students learn about history, they gain wisdom about the ways of humankind, human civilizations, and a sense of the scale and complexity of human existence. And this gives them wisdom about their own world and about why the world is the way it is. It also offers them perspective on what they cannot know, given that much is hidden in history, which is also formative of wisdom. So in an education seen through the lens of practical wisdom, students build an understanding of the world and reality through the gaining of knowledge and skills that will help them live a wise and fruitful life in the creation of God. Truth about reality, about the world that God has made, is not confessionally determined. We're not limited in our epistemology by our religious commitments. Therefore, the scope of education can be as wide and as deep as God's world is. But at the same time, Christian education will inevitably revolve around a particular religious confession. And this means there will be a Christian element to a Christian education. There simply has to be. A vision for education shaped by the Christian understanding of wisdom naturally incorporates the spiritual elements of wisdom. Because as Paul says in 2 Timothy 3:15, there is a knowledge that makes you wise for salvation. And so a Christian education that has wisdom at its core ought to incorporate the inculcation of the faith as part of its program. So I want to emphasize that along with the practical wisdom. All right, so what about worldview? How does this help us think about worldview education? All right, let me return to the mosaic metaphor. So mosaics are made up of hundreds, sometimes thousands of tiny tiles which all fit together in a big master plan. And the master plan, in my metaphor, is known comprehensively by God. But the rest of us have a limited skeletal view of reality. So what we are doing in a Christian worldview education is building towards a fuller vision of that master plan. And we do that by teaching and learning wisdom. With the accumulation of wisdom via knowledge of the relations between God, his world, and ourselves, we and our students gain a Christian worldview. The Christian worldview ought to be the telos and the goal of Christian education. We want students to leave our institutions with worldviews that are more Christian than when they arrived, to be sure. And to do that, we need to offer them wisdom instead of worldview. Worldview doesn't work as a means, but it's a wonderful goal. Knowing God, knowing ourselves, and knowing God's creation and living well and wisely in light of that knowledge, that is true wisdom. And when you have wisdom, you have a Christian worldview. Thanks for your attention.
We're going to transition to a short time of discussion. So we'll go for about 15 minutes or so, and then we will get you out of here well before 7 o'clock, okay? So thank you so much for your talk. Probably brought a lot of questions to mind. I've prepared a few questions for you. My first question is, did you choose the title of the book or did your publisher choose it? And why not call it Reforming Worldview instead of Against Worldview?
That's a really good question. When I received the publishing contract from Lexham Press, it had the title Against Worldview on it, which I'd never seen before. And so, but it's a provocative title. I think they figure it will sell more books. It probably functions in a similar way to, if I can use some local examples, Douglas Wilson wrote a book Against the Church. Peter Lightheart's written a book Against Christianity. Those two men are not against the church or against Christianity. So I think it's playing that role.
Yeah.
Provocation.
Good. All right, let me try to drive kind of right at, I think, one of the central questions people might have. And a line of critique, I think, is one you're likely to encounter. You say you don't want to use Christian worldview as a basis for education, but aren't you actually sneaking in a Christian worldview or a biblical worldview in the very account that you've given us? So let me just read a quote from your book, page 63. And this sounds a lot like biblical worldview ideas to me. So you say this: we can be confident that our senses provide a ground for knowledge of the world as it really is, despite our limitations. We can also be confident that our desire for unity of knowledge about the world is grounded in a natural drive toward higher scientific knowledge. Both reason and sense perception have their place. Both subject and object are connected, and they are primarily connected through the fact that the triune God created them all with the intention that they meet in harmonious relationship through the process of learning. I think that's beautiful, and there's a lot of background that goes into that you argued for in the book. But isn't that as an assumption or presupposition of the way you go about education, basically starting with a Christian worldview?
And I think that you're pointing to the fact of the fact that the triune God created those things as a fundamental assumption, right?
That's a fundamental assumption, but even that the senses are reliable, that our reason is actually made to be able to grasp the basic features of the world, that this all is, it's really going to work as we go try to do these things. We're not going to end up in skepticism or something like that.
Okay, yeah, good. No, it's a good question. One of my responses to that is that we're not when we act in the world and think about the world, we're not sitting there going, we're not sitting there thinking about those presuppositions. We just go out and live, and so we're not purely rational creatures who work out all of our intellectual frameworks before we go and learn, before we go and act and live in the world. So you're quite right. You could argue, I think, that maybe I'm sneaking in worldview presuppositions in there, but my view is that those presuppositions are relatively unimportant, if not distracting from the task of education, in the sense that I think education and learning, as I said, is not bound by having a Christian worldview. I think that things can be known and learnt. Aside from that, I think that the goal is to have a Christian worldview. But I think that's a good line of critique, and maybe people won't be satisfied with my answer ultimately, but I think there's a distinction to be made there.
Right. So keep it in the background. Don't make the third grader think about epistemology or something like that. Just work on,
or maybe
addition.
I mean, I think that's a fair point. I mean, I'm not against third graders thinking about epistemology, but
I was defending you on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
But so that seems like you keep it in the background. But I mean, you wouldn't really keep. Why not put some basic thing out there like God has made this amazing world. And there's all these amazing things to find. And if you go look, you'll find amazing things every day. Would that not be a kind of biblical worldview approach to education? Or
sure, yeah. If you want to frame it like that, I think that's fine. And I think we should be saying those things to our kids. And like my wife's here, Haley's there, and she says those kinds of things to our kids all the time. We homeschool the kids, or Haley does mainly. So I say, go Haley, keep saying those things. I think that's really important. I think that though that is not a that is while that's an important thing to continue to do, and I think to affirm Christian truths while you're educating children, to continue to affirm God's goodness and what the wonder of His creation, and to frame it within a theological context, I think is important. I think that I guess one thing I'm arguing is that if you frame that as Christian worldview education, then you start to fit what is, I think, the fundamental content of education, which is growing in wisdom, into frameworks that don't really work very well with that content. But I think that affirming those truths is crucial. But I don't know if I think in some ways it can be foundational. It's scaffolding for education, but it's not the main content as such.
Right.
I want to affirm what you're saying, basically, but I think we need to think about it more carefully and more deeply than that.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Yeah. So when we do that, we're not quite doing what people today talk about as biblical worldview education.
I think so. Yeah, I think it's different.
Okay. Okay, another question for you. So one of your main points, and I think this is kind of building on what we were talking about, is that worldview thinking can sometimes cut off careful observation about the world and reflection by simply assuming at the outset that we have all the right answers. So here are the 10 points of a biblical worldview. You teach your ninth grader these things, and they will know the truth in the future, right? This kind of thing. You describe it as kind of a deductive method in the books, or start with your axioms, just deduce things from them. And that resonates with me a little bit in my field. There's lots of questions we don't know the answer to. We're still lots of things to explore, to figure out. On the other hand, surely there are many questions, even substantive questions in different disciplines, that we do know the answers to, and that it would be important to keep those foregrounded in the educational process. And even foregrounding them can help us to make progress, or at least avoid bad errors. And maybe I'm a bad questioner here because I do philosophy. Maybe Christian wisdom impacts philosophy more than some other disciplines, like very directly. But if a philosopher out there starts defending abortion, right, take an ethical example, wouldn't a biblical worldview thinking be helpful in holding us back from saying, oh, well, maybe, I don't know, this guy has really good arguments. He seems really smart. I can't refute his answers right now, his arguments right now. So shouldn't I just accept it? Biblical worldview thinking can hold us back in the first case as kind of faith-seeking understanding, but in the best case is also to understand why abortion is a problem and to really build that out. You wouldn't want to leave that as an open question. Hey, it's a great world to explore. Let's just find out if abortion is right or wrong.
I totally agree. Yes. So thank you for the question. I think that's a good one. I think that I'm not throwing out the axioms or deductive reasoning entirely at all. In fact, I think you need them. You need them to learn. You need some categories within which to reason and to learn to begin with. So I think those categories are important, and I think you're quite right. As that's a good, helpful example because it shows that these categories are unavoidable. You need starting points from which to reason to truth, or even true categories within which to find more truths. So no, I definitely wouldn't be as extreme as what you're saying. And I think catechesis is a good example. So we catechize our kids, and we teach them doctrine. We teach them biblical doctrine. And we do that not because we think they can understand all of the depths of those doctrines, but because we know and trust that God will use the learning that they're doing to fill out their knowledge of Him and His world, and also to grow their love for Him too. So I think that scaffolding is important. But I think what I'm trying to drive at is more the former, which is worldview thinking has, I think, tended to displace careful and joyful exploration of God's world in some circles. I think there's a danger of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, I'll shift from interrogation mode to cooperation mode. So even to build on my example there, we sometimes think, for instance, if we teach our kids don't have sex before marriage and abortion is wrong, that we have taught them a biblical worldview of sex and everything you need to know about thinking about sex and reproduction. And so then you have things come across like in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, reproductive technologies of various kinds. And the evangelical world has been completely caught flat-footed on the reproductive technology front. And I wonder if a kind of constrained thinking is actually resulting here. So we actually, even in areas where there are key biblical worldview points that are established, there are a lot of areas we need to explore and think about better and be much more on top of than we are. And if we just assume, here's the 5 points, I read it in a worldview book, we're going to be in bad shape.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Another example, I guess, I would have is you have things called worldview. People have probably gone to worldview camps, for example. We have them in Australia. I don't know whether you have them here. You probably do.
We have them here of all kinds.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I don't think those are necessarily bad. Like, I think people go to those things and get good teaching, and they're all well-intentioned, and I'm not sort of against them per se, but I think that they can become a sort of they can be treated like a silver bullet to fix all of the counter catechesis that people are getting from the world. Actually, you know what? That kind of worldview teaching doesn't resolve all those problems. It doesn't answer all the questions. And another example, I guess, that's emerging is artificial intelligence, which is going to raise all kinds of anthropological questions for everyone. Like, literally everyone in the world is going to be confronted with those. But Christians actually could have great answers to those. I'm not sure whether we do yet, and we need to work on that. And hopefully, constrained thinking doesn't stop us from doing that. But I think that's a good point you raised. Thank you for cooperating with me. That's helpful.
Another part of the picture that you're arguing for, which I think is really compelling, is pointing towards education as engagement with the world as it is, right? And again, not assuming that we've got every piece of intellectual endeavor figured out. That really just destroys curiosity and destroys this investigation into creation. Whether we're talking about biology, right, where there's so much we have yet to learn, or the sciences there, but the other areas too, in history and these other disciplines, it seems like we start with certain fixed points, but we have to cultivate that curiosity. about the world as God really made it, right? And as he's really providentially governed it in history.
Yeah, and I use the word reality quite a lot in the book, and I think that's a helpful shorthand for what you're saying. I think we're actually reaching for reality rather than, I think if we start with the assumption that the world is not really there, or not that we don't do that. That's partly what I was saying, but I think there's actually something that we can grasp a hold of and really learn, and delight in doing that. So.
One more question. You raised in some of your discussion of education and the background to the idea of worldview. You raised the role of worldview in polemics. That worldview is, it's a combat term, right? Sort of a clash of worldviews is sort of how it emerges. And I guess a question with that, isn't training our kids in some degree of polemics important in their formation? All right. You worry that that's maybe become the only formative thing in some worldview circles. You go to worldview camp and all you learn is to fight, or et cetera. But isn't there a fight that's on? Isn't there a cosmic fight that is on? And there is ground that needs to be protected, intellectual ground, right? So the Apostle Paul talks about casting down arguments. And so is there a role where, I guess maybe I can put it this way, where's the role for polemics in Christian wisdom? And maybe more strongly, don't we need to have a role? Isn't that important? We have a coffee shop over here, the sword and the shovel, right? We've got the building and the fighting, and they're complementary actually to each other.
Yeah, and I affirm that. I think there's a place for those worldview polemics, for apologetics. All of that's really important. I think you can't frame a whole Christian education with that polemical framework, though. Is I guess what I'm suggesting, that some Christian educators have fallen into that trap. I think actually it's interesting because I'm an outsider, but I've come into Moscow, and I think I do hear a lot of worldview talk coming out of Moscow, and but I actually love what you're doing here. Like, I think you're actually not kind of doing the worldview mistakes that I'm talking about. I think it's quite different, but I think that the polemical side's crucial. I think we should teach our children apologetics. I think we should equip people with arguments. It's still really important. But it's not the basis upon which you can build a whole framework for education, which is, I think, I'm trying to reframe Christian education away from that, but I'm not excluding that as such. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our time. I was informed over text that you can get the books up here if you'd like to purchase them for $18.99 plus tax. US, I assume. So thank you again for coming out. We appreciate your participation here tonight. And please join me in thanking our speaker again.
Thanks, everyone.